In the second video on the history of American food, we'll look at the 19th century, the 1800s. During the 19th century, American food diversified with the immigration of new peoples, as we will see. Now, African Americans had obviously been here earlier than that, and they had come from numerous African cultures, bringing a variety of food culture with them. But by the 1800s, they'd adopted ingredients and cooking methods from their masters and from Native Americans. Some slaves ate at a central slave kitchen, but others were allowed to grow private gardens or even hunt or fish. Cuts of meat such as oxtails, hog jowls, neck bones, and tripe that were discarded or deemed less than desirable by their masters were also widely used. In slavery, men and women shared cooking responsibilities, but the slaves that were fed the best worked in the master's kitchen, obviously stealing and eating the food there. Some foods, such as rice and black-eyed peas, came directly or indirectly from Africa itself. Okra was also of African origin, and it became a key ingredient in meat and vegetable stews. Peanuts were originally carried by Europeans from South America to Africa before being reintroduced into North American South. The sweetness of many African American dishes may be a result of the introduction of sorghum into the South. Of course, this African American food became known as soul food much later, during the 1960s. Foods such as fried chicken or fried catfish, barbecued ribs, chitterlings, and of course the ubiquitous cornbread helped comprise a meal that today is associated with both African Americans and the American South. The French were the major European immigrant group to settle in what would become Louisiana. During the 18th century, they were joined by other immigrants of French ancestry from Canada, known as Cajuns, and whose Cajun cuisine, strongly influenced by French cooking, would become regionally important. Closely related Creole cuisine developed around the port of New Orleans. Besides French, it combined African, Native American, and Spanish elements and involved rice, game, chicken, shrimp, smoked pork, and crawfish. During most of the colonial era, white colonists had preferred British cooking methods, which was apparent in popular cookbooks. Until the French assisted the Americans in the Revolution, there had been a general disdain for French cooking. One cookbook common in the colonies, The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy by Hannah Glass, even had mocked French cooking as an odd jumble of trash. Now this began to change as America entered the 1800s. In general, by the early 1800s, American abundance was obvious in the amazing growth of the American physical stature. Early in the colonization, the average man was not much more than 5'6". By the early 1800s, by the beginning of the 19th century, however, the average man approached 5'8". In the middle of the 19th century, a wave of German immigrants came to the United States. These Germans brought their cooking and their eating culture, which introduced foods such as bratwurst and sauerkraut, among others. The Germans and other Central Europeans ate a lot of meat and potatoes, the potatoes having earlier been imported to their native countries from America. Matter of fact, all of Europe had taken to potatoes from America, although early in the 1700s, some French maintained that eating potatoes caused disease. Regardless, by the early 1800s, potatoes had become a staple of European American colonial diet, prepared in a number of ways. While there's some debate, frying potatoes created the first so-called French fries. Now they're Belgium or France. We're not sure. Although, of course, fish and chips, all fried, is a classic English dish. German immigrants were also known for their pretzels, which first arrived with Dutch and German immigrants to Pennsylvania in the late 1700s. Pretzels remained a local cuisine, used as either a side dish with meat or as a dessert, until the 1800s when German-American bakers began to prepare them with less water, which made them harder. They then quickly spread across the north. Of course, German, and later Irish, immigrants were also known for their considerable consumption of beer. The first beers in America were ales, as I've already said, and many historians attribute the first American lagers to German immigrants in the early 1800s. Of course, by the mid-1800s, people of Mexican descent had been in the Southwest for generations. The staples of the Mexican immigrant diet were tortillas and beans. The former, flat pieces of bread made from corn, were eaten plain, rolled, and filled with chicken or pork to make enchiladas, or, alternatively, folded and fried as tacos to hold similar sort of fillings. Beans were boiled and often crushed and fried in fat. Mexican cooking made use of chili peppers of varying hotness, as well as hot sauces made of chilies and spices. Mexican Americans, many poor, used what were regarded as less desirable cuts of meats in stews and versions of the spicy Spanish sausages known as chorizos. Chili, a stew made from beef or pork cooked slowly with chilies and tomatoes, evolved numerous regional variations in the Southwest over time, and, by the 20th century, had become a staple of the American diet. Common among all Central American migrants were tamales, corn dough packed around a meat or cheese filling wrapped in corn husk and steamed for consumption at Christmas. As was the case with other aspects of food preparation, the time-consuming process of preparing the tamales fell to women. With the invention of the clipper ships and the discovery of gold in California in 1848, thousands of Chinese arrived. Due to growing anti-Chinese prejudice and the desire for Chinese immigrants themselves to maintain their cultural identity, these Chinese immigrants in the 19th century California lived in myriad Chinatowns, neighborhoods in which they opened their own groceries and their own restaurants. They continued to consume traditional foods, leading to the importation of millions of tons of rice. Stir-fried dishes were preferred as a means of saving fuel, and most ate with the traditional Chinese utensils, chopsticks. Because most Chinese, like most peoples of Asian origin, are lactose intolerant, they did not eat a lot of dairy products. By the middle of the 19th century, a growing movement associated good health with specific types of diets. Some were quite odd, but others, such as vegetarianism, made more sense. One advocate for health was Sylvester Graham, shown here, who argued that the key was eating large quantities of ground whole wheat. He produced a cracker of such, which became known, of course, as graham crackers, and you can see that on the right. By the middle of the 19th century, Americans on the East Coast had begun importing ice from the North, facilitated by faster ships and new, specifically designed ice boxes, which were first developed in America in the early 1800s. People would also build insulated ice houses underground. This led to the expansion of what they called ice cream, which in various forms had been around in northern climates since the Roman Empire. It was first reported in the United States during the colonial era. Now people further south, or at least along the seacoast, could enjoy the frozen dessert at least as long as it lasted. Ice cream was seen as a luxury during the 1800s. Providing adequate food for Americans was challenging in the Civil War, especially when so many Americans were in the military and the fighting destroyed so much land. Not surprisingly, women played a greater role. While both armies tried to provide rations for the soldiers, foraging and even pillaging was common, especially as the Confederacy disintegrated. Individual soldiers would often carry their food in a so-called haversack carried over their shoulders, and you can see one here. Soldiers on both sides ate a lot of hardtack. Hardtack was a simple type of biscuit or cracker made from flour, water, and sometimes salt. Hardtack was inexpensive and long-lasting, used for sustenance in the absence of perishable food. Salt pork, which resembled a thick slab of bacon, was common as, fresh pork was rare. Now, after the Civil War, there was a growing desire for beef, even as the major cattle production remained in places like Texas and the Southwest. Without refrigeration, the problem was how to get the cattle to market before it spoiled. An entrepreneur named Joseph McCoy, and you can see him on the left here, came up with the idea of the cattle drives in the late 1860s. He followed an old Indian trail, that a half Indian, half white guy named Jesse Chisholm had identified and became known as the Chisholm Trail. Anyway, the Chisholm Trail was the first of these cattle drives, driving the cattle up north, and started in the 1860s. They would march the cattle northward to the new transcontinental railroad lines, and there the new so-called cattle cars could take the cattle to market in the large northern and eastern cities, and so the meat wouldn't go bad. Other entrepreneurs followed McCoy and made considerable profits. A cow might cost $3 or $4 in Texas, but fetch 10 times as much at northern markets. Now here you see a cowboy. His job was to drive the cattle northward to the railroads, and it was hard labor, and you could get a cowboy very cheaply. They were paid only a few dollars at the delivery of the cattle. And their diet, of course, wasn't very varied. A lot of beans in their diet. The peak of the cattle drives was in the 1870s when by that point, four major routes had emerged. There was the Shawnee Trail, the easternmost route, which went up from South Texas to Sedalia, Missouri, and then the old Chisholm Trail, which I'd mentioned, the Western Trail, and the farthest Western Trail was the Goodnight Loving Trail, which went up the east slope of the Rocky Mountains through one of the new cities that was emerging there, Denver, growing with all the silver coming out of the Rockies. In any event, the cattle drives did not last long because the railroads saw everybody trying to get to their transcontinental railroad, and they started building railroads southward. With the new emergence of beef in the northern cities, by the late 1800s and early 1900s, people were referring to what called hamburgers, and that was based on meat with bread together, common in places like Hamburg, Germany. So that's where you got the idea of a hamburger. By the late 19th century, those Chinese Americans that I mentioned earlier developed a new cuisine for non-Chinese diners. Inexpensive dishes such as chow mein were created by immigrant Chinese cooks, but despite, or perhaps because of, their inauthentic nature, they proved to be popular with non-Chinese diners. At the same time, many Chinese restaurants continue to supply authentic dishes to their own ethnic customers. What Americans think of as the traditional conclusion to a Chinese meal, the fortune cookie, is said to have been invented in America near the turn of the 20th century. Also, by the late 1800s, German immigrants had introduced what became known as the hot dog. The term dog had been associated with sausages as early as the early 1800s in Germany, perhaps because people accused sausage makers of using dog meat in their products. The hot dog was grilled or steamed food where a sausage was served in a slit of a partially sliced bun. It can also refer to the sausage itself. The sausage used is the Wiener or Vienna sausage or the Frankfurter. By the early 20th century, hot dogs have become a working class street food sold by carts or stands in big cities, most notably in New York. It also quickly was adopted by the fans of the new sport of baseball. By the early 20th century, one of the most famous sellers of hot dogs was, of course, Coney Island's Nathan's, and that's where they still have the hot dog eating contest I'm sure you may have heard of. Now, but you get to the late 1800s, the late 19th century, Italian immigrants are going to grow dramatically. Spaghetti and meatballs was a common innovation of Italian immigrants in New York City, who had access to more plentiful meat supply than people in Italy. Various forms of pizza go back centuries in Italy. Of course, the idea of pizzas with tomato sauce was only after tomatoes had come from America. In any event, when the new Italian immigrants came over, they brought pizza with them. Pizzas didn't become nationally popular in the United States, however, until the American troops had returned from Italy after World War II. They'd been exposed to it over there. The type of pizza, however, varied as it spread across America after World War II. There were, of course, a number of regional variations. I should note that by the late 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was taking place, and they'd started canning foods. And the food obviously would last a lot longer canned. The problem was you never knew if the business which had made the canned goods was actually putting what they said into the can. It was a period of laissez-faire, lack of government regulation, and it was kind of buyers beware when you eat it. Here's a cartoon showing that. And so there was a problem for consumers of food because a lot of that canned food was dangerous or at least unhealthy. This concludes the second of the three videos on the history of American food.